They escorted me out of the building on a Tuesday morning, claiming I was a poor cultural fit for their visionary startup. Exactly 3 days later, federal agents swarmed our glass headquarters. My former boss and his glamorous deputy were led away in handcuffs, watching their $200 million federal fraud collapse. They thought firing the lead data auditor would bury their secrets permanently. They forgot I kept the server logs. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. We are so incredibly grateful for your continued support of our channel. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep producing the content you love. If you enjoy today's video, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you will get access to exclusive, longer, and incredibly detailed true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot share publicly on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code right here on the screen, or by clicking the Patreon link down in the description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's story, where I, Ariana Jimenez, will show you exactly what happens when a company tries to bury its lead data auditor. I am 34 years old, and until a few months ago, I was the senior data auditor at Verdant Core Solutions. If you live anywhere near the west coast of the United States, you have probably seen their aggressive marketing campaigns. They were the undisputed golden child of the green technology startup world, plastering their bright, eco-friendly logos on billboards from Seattle to San Diego. Their entire business model was built on a remarkably bold promise to completely revolutionize environmental sustainability through advanced carbon capture algorithms. But if we are being brutally honest, looking past the polished veneer, their real ambition had absolutely nothing to do with saving the planet. Their singular obsessive goal was securing massive, multi-million-dollar federal infrastructure grants. My job was supposed to be the absolute backbone of that grand ambition. I was strictly hired to verify the numbers, ensuring our back-end systems actually achieved what our aggressive marketing department claimed they did. When I first joined the company, our chief executive officer, Julian Vance, was a vastly different person. Back in those early days, he was a genuine, hard-working software engineer. He used to wear faded band t-shirts, surviving on stale coffee, and spending late nights in the freezing server room, passionately debating the technical constraints of our processing capabilities. But somewhere along the line, the toxic vanity of the startup ecosystem thoroughly poisoned him. As the venture capital money started flowing in, the brilliant engineer vanished without a trace, rapidly replaced by an insufferable spotlight addict. Julian traded his comfortable t-shirts for bespoke Italian designer suits that cost more than my monthly rent. He completely stopped reading dense technical reports and started aggressively obsessing over his flattering profiles in glossy business magazines. His daily vocabulary shifted away from system latency and data integrity to empty corporate buzzwords like synergy, disruptive paradigms, and unicorn potential. He became a hollow man hopelessly addicted to his own reflection, eager to swallow any manufactured flattery that came his way. That desperate, pathetic need for constant validation perfectly paved the way for Chloe Sterling. Chloe was brought in out of nowhere as our brand new Vice President of Sustainable Development. I still do not understand how she managed to pass a single technical interview. A very quick background check revealed she was nothing more than a former social media influencer who had previously built a moderately successful brand selling overpriced organic detox teas. She was utterly clueless about complex system analysis, back-end server architecture, or even fundamental environmental science. But Chloe possessed one terrifyingly effective skill. She knew exactly how to manipulate people. And she zeroed in on Julian's heavily inflated ego with the ruthless precision of a heat-seeking missile. She fed him a daily diet of excessive, unearned praise, manipulating him so seamlessly that he willingly handed her the keys to the entire corporate kingdom. Within less than 6 months, this woman, who quite literally did not know the difference between a megabyte and a megawatt, was making final executive decisions on our most critical technological infrastructure. The daily contrast inside the corporate office became suffocating. The entire executive suite quickly devolved into a ridiculous circus of pure vanity. Julian and Chloe spent their working hours taking lavish 3-hour client lunches and posing for expensive corporate photo shoots, their bright smiles perfectly rehearsed for their next viral networking post. Meanwhile, I remained quietly in the shadows, desperately trying to anchor the sinking company to reality. I have always been a creature of extreme professional caution and meticulous habit. While they were busy selling a beautiful, lucrative illusion to investors, I was painstakingly archiving the cold, hard truth. I silently saved every single system log. I heavily encrypted and backed up every hidden email chain. I meticulously tracked the revision history of every technical document that passed through the company network. I knew exactly every time a crucial number was tweaked, every time a metric was falsely exaggerated, and precisely who had pressed the keys to do it. I became the silent, invisible observer of their rapidly deepening corruption. Inevitably, my stubborn insistence on empirical truth became a massive inconvenience to their grand, profitable narrative. I clearly remember when I started noticing the subtle, calculated shift to push me out. First, my calendar invites to the weekly, high-level strategy meetings were quietly canceled without explanation. Then, I found my administrative credentials revoked, leaving me completely locked out of the core financial projection channels. Whenever I miraculously managed to corner Julian to present hard, undeniable evidence that our carbon capture metrics were falling dangerously short of the required federal standards, I was consistently met with dramatic eye rolls and heavy sighs. "Ariana, you are focusing way too much on the micro level," Julian would say, arrogantly adjusting his expensive silk tie. "We are selling a massive vision of the future. You need to learn how to see the bigger picture and stop being such a rigid bottleneck." My rigorous, highly detailed data reports, which took dozens of hours of careful analysis to compile, were blatantly ignored and tossed into the shredder. Instead, the wealthy board of directors was treated to Chloe's hollow, buzzword-filled weekly presentations. She would stand confidently at the front of the expensive glass boardroom, effortlessly flipping through beautifully designed slides with flashy animations, confidently presenting completely fabricated projections that made Julian look like a visionary genius. I sat alone in my isolated cubicle, watching this incredibly toxic delusion completely take over the company I had helped build, knowing deep down that a fragile system built entirely on lies always eventually collapses. I just did not realize yet that I would be the exact person to pull the pin. It was 9:15 on a Friday night, and the corporate office was completely dead. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning was the only sound echoing through the empty glass-walled corridors. I was sitting alone in my dimly lit cubicle, staring at a monitor that felt like it was burning a hole right through my retinas. On my screen was the finalized compliance report, the absolute final hurdle before Verdant Core Solutions submitted our application for a $200 million federal infrastructure grant. The government funding was designed specifically to reward highly efficient green technology, and this single document was the golden ticket that would permanently cement the company into the big leagues. My strict mandate was supposed to be just a routine final sweep, a superficial rubber stamp requested by the legal department before the Monday morning deadline. But my instincts, honed by over a decade of auditing complex data structures, were screaming that something was fundamentally misaligned. I started pulling the raw ingestion metrics directly from the primary sensor arrays located at our physical test facility. As I cross-referenced the physical sensor outputs with the final spreadsheet dashboard, a cold knot formed deep in my stomach. The numbers simply did not match up. The raw data showed a steady, modest carbon capture rate, which was perfectly normal for a prototype phase, but the final presentation dashboard was displaying numbers exactly 3 times higher. It was not a rounding error, it was not a graphical glitch, it was a precise, calculated mathematical multiplication. I dug deeper into the spreadsheet architecture, completely bypassing the locked viewing modes, and began unpacking the hidden developer scripts. There, buried under 12 layers of nested conditional formatting, I found it. It was an unauthorized, highly obfuscated macro code functioning silently in the background. Someone had explicitly named the file directory the optimization patch. What it actually did was intercept the raw telemetry data coming from the field sensors, artificially multiply every single carbon reduction value by exactly 3.0, and seamlessly feed those manipulated numbers into the final federal application. It was elegant, incredibly difficult to spot, and entirely illegal. My hands were physically shaking as my fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I needed to know exactly how this malicious script bypassed our internal security protocols. Avoiding the standard user interface, I opened a secure terminal command line and directly queried the main server logs. I traced the specific execution string of the optimization patch backward through the firewall history. The digital breadcrumbs led me straight away from our internal engineering team and out to an external proxy server. Using a backdoor diagnostic tool I had installed months prior for routine maintenance, I managed to unearth a deeply buried, deleted email chain residing in a quarantined sector of the Exchange server. The messages were exchanged exactly 3 weeks ago. The sender was Julian Vance. The recipient was an independent, offshore software contractor. The subject line innocently read as an urgent time zone bug update. However, the body of the email contained highly specific instructions to create an aggressive scaling multiplier that would run invisibly during any data export process. Julian had explicitly authorized a mercenary coder to rig our entire reporting system. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the horrifying reality washing over me like ice water. Verdant Core Solutions was not a revolutionary technology company. Our core algorithm was completely ineffective, struggling to capture even a fraction of the carbon we proudly advertised on national television. We were nothing more than a carefully constructed facade, a giant hollow shell painted bright green. The $200 million federal grant was not an investment in the future of the planet. It was the ultimate prize in an unprecedented, colossal greenwashing fraud scheme. They were knowingly and deliberately preparing to steal hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars using fabricated environmental data. If this application went through, and the government eventually audited the actual physical test sites, the resulting fallout would not just be a corporate bankruptcy, it would mean devastating federal indictments, severe prison sentences for the entire executive board, and the complete destruction of anyone associated with the data validation team. Namely, me. They were setting me up to be the perfect, unaware scapegoat when the inevitable federal investigation came crashing down on our heads. But Julian was never technically proficient enough to design a data laundering scheme this sophisticated on his own. He was a hardware guy, hopelessly out of touch with modern back-end manipulation. The meticulous nature of the macro reeked of a different kind of cunning. I needed the absolute root source. I downloaded the original encrypted work order file attached to the email chain and ran it through a deep hex editor to strip away the surface data. I bypassed the standard file properties and aggressively extracted the raw, unedited metadata embedded deep within the document architecture. I isolated the original digital footprint of the device that authored the initial work order request. The system returned a specific, localized IP address. I immediately cross-referenced that numeric string with our internal hardware registry. The result on my screen made my blood run entirely cold. The IP address did not belong to Julian. It did not belong to the engineering department. It perfectly matched the expensive, top-of-the-line personal laptop assigned exclusively to Chloe Sterling. The revelation was absolute and undeniable. Julian might have been the one to carelessly send the email, completely blinded by his desperate thirst for industry dominance and massive wealth. But Chloe was the actual architect. She was the hidden puppet master, brilliantly exploiting Julian's vanity and greed, pulling the strings from the shadows to secure a massive payout for herself while leaving everyone else completely vulnerable to federal prison. The optimization patch was her masterpiece, and I had just captured the undeniable digital proof. By the time the sun came up on Monday morning, my resolve was completely solidified into ice. I arrived at the office a full 2 hours before the standard corporate rush, heading straight for the secure network printer located in the dimly lit basement. I meticulously printed out the raw, unencrypted server logs, the complete metadata history, and the explicit email chain that perfectly outlined the entire optimization patch operation. I deliberately placed every single damning page inside a thick, bright red manila folder. It felt incredibly heavy in my hands, a physical manifestation of a massive federal crime just waiting to detonate. I marched directly up the stairs to the executive suite and demanded an immediate, closed-door emergency meeting with Julian. I completely bypassed his extremely protective administrative assistant, stating firmly and loudly that the future of the entire company was at immediate, critical risk. When I finally forced my way into the sprawling, glass-walled executive boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with suffocating arrogance. Julian was slouched casually in his custom leather chair, aggressively scrolling through his smartphone screen, barely acknowledging my physical presence in the room. Chloe was perched right next to him, sipping an overly complicated iced latte, her posture radiating pure, unfiltered contempt. I slammed the heavy red folder directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table, the loud smack echoing off the glass walls. I clearly and calmly explained to them both that the data being prepared for the federal grant submission was mathematically rigged. I laid out the precise legal consequences, telling them in no uncertain terms that submitting false environmental metrics to the United States government would unequivocally result in severe federal prison sentences for everyone involved in the executive chain of command. I expected shock. I expected immediate panic. I even expected a desperate, scrambling attempt to feign complete ignorance. Instead, Julian did not even bother to look up from his glowing screen. He let out a prolonged, theatrical sigh of sheer annoyance, as if I had merely interrupted his morning stock market review. Chloe, however, leaned forward and offered a cold, venomous smirk that made my skin crawl. "Ariana, you are being incredibly dramatic," Chloe drawled, her voice dripping with thick, condescending sarcasm. "You are just an old-fashioned obstacle always trying to stand in the way of a truly grand vision. You do not understand how modern startups operate. We are painting a beautiful picture of what we will become, not the ugly reality of what we are right this second. It is called aggressive forward projection." I stared at her, completely appalled by the sheer audacity of her criminal delusion. I turned my absolute attention back to Julian, practically begging him to open the red folder and look at the hard, undeniable evidence I had painstakingly gathered. I pleaded with him to remember the honest, dedicated engineer he used to be before the venture capital money rotted his brain. But Julian simply reached out his perfectly manicured hand and physically pushed the bright red folder off the edge of the table. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull, pathetic thud. "I am not reading that paranoid garbage," Julian snapped, finally locking his cold, empty eyes onto mine. "You need to learn how to be flexible with the numbers. Ariana, this rigid, bureaucratic mentality of yours is exactly why you are constantly holding this company back from its true potential. I am completely barring you from any further involvement with the federal grant application. You are to return to your desk and focus strictly on low-level internal server maintenance. If you step out of line again or interfere with Chloe's work, there will be severe and immediate consequences." I did not argue with his foolishness. I bent down, quietly picked up the red folder, and walked out of the glass room. I knew right then, with absolute certainty, that the point of no return had been officially crossed. Exactly 48 hours later, the final execution order was swiftly delivered. It was shortly after lunch on Wednesday when my desk phone rang. It was the Director of Human Resources, instructing me to report to the third-floor conference room immediately. There was no prior calendar invite sent to my inbox, no warning message, and absolutely no stated agenda, just a cold, sterile summons. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the Human Resources suite, the trap was already fully set. Julian and Chloe were sitting close together on one side of a long wooden table, flanked by two towering, silent corporate security guards, dressed in immaculate black suits. The Human Resources representative looked extremely uncomfortable, staring intently at her yellow notepad and aggressively refusing to make any eye contact with me. "We are terminating your employment at Verdant Core Solutions, effective immediately," Julian announced, his voice entirely devoid of any recognizable human emotion. Chloe leaned back in her expensive ergonomic chair, a look of profound, sickening satisfaction washing over her heavily contoured face. "We simply feel that you are a very poor cultural fit for the dynamic, forward-thinking environment we are desperately trying to cultivate here," she added, clearly relishing every single syllable of the corporate execution she had orchestrated. They demanded my physical security keycard right then and there. Before I could even reach into my pocket, the human resources representative nervously informed me that my administrative system access had already been permanently revoked exactly 5 minutes prior. Julian coldly instructed the 2 security guards to physically escort me back to my cubicle to collect my personal belongings, and then march me directly out of the front doors of the building. They wanted it to be a massive, humiliating public spectacle. They wanted to parade me through the open-plan office space in front of dozens of my silent, terrified colleagues to make a clear, intimidating example out of the one woman who dared to question their supreme authority. But they fundamentally misunderstood the type of person they were dealing with. As the massive security guards flanked my sides, I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg on my knees for my job. And I certainly did not engage in a futile, desperate screaming match. The absolute dead silence from my end seemed to unnerve them far more than any emotional outburst ever could have. I simply looked back and forth between Julian and Chloe, letting a slow, deliberate half-smile creep across my face. It was a smile full of heavy, dangerous, hidden meaning. I turned around on my heels, calmly walked to my desk with the guards trailing closely behind, and quietly packed my solitary coffee mug and my framed photograph into a small cardboard box. I walked gracefully down the main corporate corridor, holding my head incredibly high, completely ignoring the frantic, hushed whispers of my former coworkers. I stepped through the heavy glass lobby doors and out into the bright, warm afternoon sun, feeling completely at peace. I knew exactly what was safely stored in my personal cloud drive, and I knew that the heavy guillotine they thought they had just dropped on my neck was actually hovering directly over theirs. The commute back to my downtown apartment was incredibly peaceful. The mid-afternoon traffic was unusually light, and the silence in my car was a welcome contrast to the toxic noise I had just left behind. When I walked through my front door, my golden retriever greeted me with a wagging tail. Completely unaware that my corporate life had just been violently terminated, I gently patted his head, kicked off my uncomfortable work shoes, and walked straight to my home office. I sat down at my solid oak desk and booted up my personal laptop. This machine was completely isolated from the Verdant Core network, but it held the key to their absolute destruction. Months ago, long before their hostility became openly apparent, I had quietly established an encrypted, heavily secured cloud backup system. The severely underfunded and thoroughly incompetent internal IT department at the company had absolutely no idea this invisible bridge even existed. It was a completely untraceable digital vault, and it contained every single piece of evidence I had ever gathered. I opened the secure portal and typed in my 32-character master password. The interface bloomed to life, displaying a pristine, perfectly organized archive of the company's darkest secrets. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. This was not a moment for rushed anger. It was a moment for absolute, clinical execution. I located the master folder and began extracting the critical assets. First, I pulled the raw, unedited email exchange that contained the optimization patch. Then, I attached the incontrovertible metadata reports, clearly highlighting the localized IP address that traced the initial work order directly back to Chloe Sterling. Finally, I secured the most damning piece of the puzzle. It was Julian Vance's cryptographic electronic approval signature. It was legally binding, mathematically verifiable, and permanently attached to the fraudulent deployment order. I organized these files into a single, highly compressed secure folder. It was a devastating digital weapon, neatly packaged and ready for immediate deployment. I opened my secure, anonymous email client and initiated a new message draft. Many people in my position would have been tempted to write a lengthy, bitter manifesto. They would have typed out paragraphs of furious accusations, demanding justice and expressing their deep emotional pain. I did absolutely none of that. I left the entire body of the email completely blank. There were no petty insults, no desperate pleas for validation, and absolutely no childish threats of revenge. I simply titled the subject line as Federal Fraud Evidence Regarding Verdant Core Solutions Grant Application. I wanted the profound silence of my message to amplify the deafening roar of the attached server logs. The cold, unfeeling data did not need my personal commentary to explain the massive crime being committed. The raw numbers were entirely capable of speaking for themselves, and they were screaming federal perjury. Choosing the exact recipients for this payload required precise tactical calculation. Leaking this to the tech press or a major news outlet would have just created a messy, sensationalized media circus. The expensive company lawyers would have immediately spun a narrative of a disgruntled, crazy former employee seeking petty revenge. I completely bypassed the media. Instead, I pasted the direct, personal email address of the chief inspector at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission into the primary recipient field. This was the exact government division strictly responsible for vetting and approving the $200 million infrastructure grant. Then, I executed my favorite strategic maneuver. I added the offshore contractor who originally wrote the malicious macro code into the carbon copy line. By directly including him in the chain to a top federal investigator, I effectively trapped him in a psychological corner. The moment he saw that email, sheer terror would completely paralyze him. He would realize instantly that the federal government already had the files, completely destroying any foolish thoughts he might have had about frantically wiping his own servers to protect Julian. The evidence was now permanently locked into the public record. I took one final, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. My finger hovered over the trackpad for just a fraction of a second before I firmly pressed the send button. A tiny swoosh sound echoed from the speakers, confirming the delivery. The heavy burden I had been carrying for months instantly lifted from my shoulders. I calmly closed the laptop, the satisfying click of the screen shutting signaling the end of my corporate nightmare. I walked into my kitchen, carefully ground some premium dark roast coffee beans, and slowly brewed myself a flawlessly rich cup of coffee. The aroma filled the apartment, warm and deeply comforting. I grabbed my dog's leash, took a slow sip of the perfect brew, and headed out for a long, leisurely afternoon walk in the nearby park. The sky was clear, the breeze was perfectly cool, and somewhere across the city, a devastating, invisible time bomb had just begun its final, unstoppable countdown. The absolute destruction of their carefully curated illusion finally arrived on a Thursday morning. The sleek, heavily photographed startup headquarters was violently thrust into pure, unadulterated chaos when a massive fleet of heavily armored, matte black government sport utility vehicles screeched to a halt, completely blocking every single exit of the verdant core building. Before the expensive lobby security guards could even process what was happening, dozens of stern federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets swarmed through the main glass doors. They moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency. The agents aggressively ordered every single employee to immediately step away from their keyboards and keep their hands completely visible. A specialized cybersecurity strike team descended directly into the basement server room, physically ripping out hard drives and securing every single piece of digital infrastructure before the internal team could even attempt to initiate a system wipe. Bright yellow federal crime scene tape was aggressively slapped across the pristine glass walls of the executive suite, physically locking the toxic leadership inside their own vanity project. Inside that sprawling conference room, the suffocating, arrogant confidence Julian Vance had weaponized against me just 48 hours prior completely evaporated into thin air. The flawless executive was now dripping with cold, pathetic sweat. His trembling hands fumbled desperately with his expensive smartphone, frantically dialing the private numbers of the most ruthless, high-priced corporate defense attorneys on the West Coast. But his entire defensive strategy shattered the exact moment the lead federal investigator began laying out the precise, undeniable details of the search warrant. Julian suffered a devastating, physically paralyzing realization. The government agents did not just have vague suspicions based on an anonymous tip. They possessed the exact, perfectly preserved server logs. They had the highly obfuscated optimization patch, the raw, unaltered telemetry data, and the cryptographically secure electronic signature proving his direct involvement. Julian looked at the heavily armed agents, realizing with absolute, horrifying clarity that my silent, peaceful departure was not a retreat. It was a perfectly calculated execution. He was completely trapped in a nightmare of his own making, facing decades in federal prison with absolutely zero room to negotiate or manipulate his way out. Just as Julian was completely breaking down, the ultimate, sickening betrayal unfolded right before his eyes. Seeing the massive corporate ship sinking at lightning speed, Chloe Sterling did what she always did best. She ruthlessly manipulated the narrative to save her own skin. She suddenly collapsed into a heavy leather chair, burying her face in her hands and unleashing a perfectly rehearsed, incredibly loud flood of theatrical tears. Her voice trembled violently as she falsely claimed she had been living in absolute terror of Julian for the past 6 months. She dramatically unzipped her expensive designer handbag and slammed a thick stack of printed emails and forged internal memos onto the table. She had meticulously prepared this completely fabricated portfolio as an emergency contingency plan, designed specifically to frame Julian as a rogue, tyrannical leader who forcefully mandated the fraudulent algorithm against her fierce, constant objections. Chloe passionately declared herself a brave, silenced whistleblower, desperately hoping to secure full federal immunity and conveniently position herself to hijack the chief executive officer position once Julian was safely locked behind bars. It was a terrifyingly brilliant masterclass in sociopathic corporate survival. However, her desperate gamble fundamentally underestimated the absolute, unforgiving power of immutable digital forensics. Her entire theatrical performance was abruptly cut short when the lead federal inspector slowly reached into his thick leather briefcase. He did not even bother glancing at the forged documents she had just presented. Instead, he slammed a single, highly detailed technical report directly onto the center of the mahogany table. It was the exact metadata extraction I had securely transmitted. The inspector pointed a stern, unyielding finger at the printed lines of code, loudly reading out the localized Internet Protocol address that definitively authored the initial work order for the malicious macro. He looked dead into Chloe's fake, tear-filled eyes and clearly stated that the digital footprint matched her personal company laptop with 100% certainty. He revealed to the entire room that she was the original, calculating architect of the entire illegal algorithm. Her carefully constructed victim narrative shattered into a million irreparable pieces right then and there. The fake crying completely stopped, instantly replaced by a pale, terrified mask of absolute defeat as she realized there was no escaping the digital paper trail. The grand finale of their corporate reign was a spectacle of pure, satisfying justice. Julian and Chloe, the two arrogant executives who had built a massive, fraudulent empire on vanity and lies, were both aggressively forced against the expensive glass walls and placed in heavy steel handcuffs. The federal agents marched them out of the executive suite, deliberately parading them directly through the open-plan office space. They were paraded in front of the exact same dozens of silent, terrified colleagues they had used to humiliate me just days before. There were no arrogant smirks this time, only the devastating humiliation of a very public downfall. The explosive news of the massive federal raid hit the global financial wires before the government vehicles even left the parking lot. Within less than 2 hours, Verdant Core Solutions saw hundreds of millions of dollars in internal valuation completely vanish into thin air. The powerful venture capitalists and wealthy board members desperately scrambled to dump their shares, fleeing the sinking company in a state of absolute chaotic despair. The shiny green empire had completely collapsed in record time, entirely destroyed by a single, invisible string of truth they thought they could easily bury. Several weeks had passed since the spectacular federal raid completely shattered the illusion of Verdant Core Solutions. The once bustling, arrogant headquarters was now a hollow ghost town, echoing only with the desperate panic of the surviving executives. The remaining members of the board of directors were frantically scrambling in the dark, desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny fragments of legitimate proprietary technology were left uncorrupted by the fraudulent optimization patch. They were terrified of facing complete and total corporate liquidation. The federal court system had aggressively frozen their remaining operational assets, firmly demanding a fully transparent, perfectly accurate baseline report of their actual carbon capture capabilities before even considering allowing them to financially restructure. But they had a massive, insurmountable problem. The internal data infrastructure was an absolute labyrinth of heavily manipulated files. And the only two people who knew the true extent of the rot were currently sitting in federal holding cells awaiting their criminal trials. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon that my personal cell phone rang. The caller identification displayed the private number of the chairman of the board of directors. I let it ring 4 times before calmly pressing the answer button. When he finally spoke, the usual commanding, arrogant tone of a powerful venture capitalist was completely gone. His voice was remarkably thin, shaking with undeniable desperation and profound regret. "Ariana, we made a catastrophic mistake," the chairman pleaded, practically hyperventilating over the secure line. "The federal investigators have completely locked us out of our own back-end servers. We cannot generate the strictly accurate compliance reports the judges are demanding. We know about your encrypted cloud backups. We are begging you to come back and help us rebuild the database and restore the true numbers. We will give you whatever you want." I listened to his desperate, pathetic pleas in absolute silence, letting him thoroughly embarrass himself. When he finally ran out of breath, I calmly delivered my response. "I am no longer an obedient employee you can simply discard when my data contradicts your marketing strategy," I replied, my tone as cold and hard as steel. "Under absolutely no circumstances will I ever return to my previous role. If I agree to untangle this massive mess, I will return exclusively as a totally independent auditor, operating under the direct, legally binding authorization and strict supervision of the federal court itself. I will not report to you, and I will not conform to your toxic corporate culture." "We accept," he surrendered immediately, his voice practically breaking. "Just tell us what it will take. My financial compensation will be precisely 10 times my previous annual salary," I stated clearly, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "That entire sum must be paid completely up front and held securely in an independent legal escrow account before I even look at a single line of code. Furthermore, my contract will include an absolute, unquestionable veto power over any future decisions made by the board of directors regarding technical metrics, marketing data, or environmental projections. If I say a specific number is mathematically false, it gets deleted instantly, and you have zero authority to override me." There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The chairman knew I had him backed into an inescapable corner. Without my pristine, meticulously archived backups and my intimate understanding of the system architecture, it would take an external forensic accounting firm several years and tens of millions of dollars to piece together the shattered puzzle. The company simply did not have that kind of time before the government liquidated everything. Swallowing his immense pride, and with absolutely no other viable options available on the entire planet, the chairman bitterly agreed to every single condition. The very next morning, the desperately cornered board of directors signed the most aggressively expensive, one-sided consulting contract in the entire history of the company. 2 days later, I confidently walked back through the heavy glass lobby doors of the exact same building they had so publicly dragged me out of. The few remaining employees parted like the Red Sea, watching me in stunned, respectful silence. I completely bypassed the cramped basement cubicles and took the private elevator directly up to the sprawling executive suite. I walked straight into the magnificent glass boardroom, dropped my leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany table, and sat down comfortably in the massive, custom leather chair at the very head of the room. It was the exact chair Julian Vance used to occupy when he thought he ruled the world. I opened my laptop, initiated the clean data restoration protocol, and simply smiled as the massive monitors on the wall began displaying the cold, harsh, beautiful reality of the genuine carbon capture metrics. The most exquisite form of professional revenge is not burning an empire to the ground. True. Absolute power is forcing the exact people who ruthlessly underestimated you to empty their pockets and desperately pay you a fortune just to grant them salvation. The greatest, most valuable asset in the modern corporate world is never a flashy buzzword-filled presentation. It is the undeniable truth, meticulously archived, permanently stored, and wielded with perfect, devastating timing. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let us know in the comments below. We absolutely love reading them. As we mentioned earlier, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep producing these videos. If you found today's journey into corporate justice as satisfying as I did, we would be deeply honored if you could help support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to our absolute best, highly exclusive true stories featuring incredibly detailed situations and multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot share publicly on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code right on your screen, or by using the link provided in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you again for being so wonderfully supportive, and we will see you in the next story.